In this video, I present what I think are the top 5 most important things for you to know about the Gospel of John. We'll begin with number 5 and move our way down to number 1. Number 5. The Gospel of John is significantly different from the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke, written in that order. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be seen together. They contain parallel literary material that, when set side by side, makes it absolutely clear that they're in a direct literary relationship with one another. The same is not true of the Gospel of John, which is independent of the Synoptics. John doesn't borrow material from Mark the way that Matthew and Luke do. There's no direct literary relationship. This being the case, John contains much material that's not paralleled in the Synoptics. There are significant differences between the content of John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the Synoptics, it's implied that Jesus' ministry only lasts about a year, or at least Jesus only makes one fateful and fatal pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John, Jesus is moving in and out of Jerusalem more frequently, traveling there at least 3 different times. Much of the narrative of John thus occurs in Jerusalem, whereas in the Synoptics, most of Jesus' ministry occurs in the towns and villages of Galilee. The mode of teaching differs between John and the Synoptics. In the Synoptics, Jesus teaches in parables, short stories meant to make 1 or 2 points. Jesus teaches in lengthy discourses in the Gospel of John. If you look at John in a red letter Bible, you find large swaths of red. Sometimes Jesus goes on for entire pages uninterrupted. As one New Testament scholar puts it, wordy is the Lamb in John. In John, Jesus' powerful actions are called signs very explicitly, and they're meant to reveal Jesus' identity. In the Synoptics, Jesus performs many different miracles, and one of the kinds of miracles that's completely absent from the Gospel of John, but prominent in the Synoptics, is exorcisms. In the Synoptics, Jesus casts out unclean spirit after unclean spirit. In John, however, there are no unclean spirits, no evil spirits, or no demons whatsoever. Finally, many of the most famous stories about Jesus occur only in either the Synoptics or in John, but not in both. Only the Synoptics have Jesus being tempted by Satan in the wilderness, Jesus telling the disciples that the Messiah will suffer and be crucified by religious authorities, Jesus being transfigured on the top of a mountain, and Jesus directly predicting the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. Only in the Gospel of John does Lazarus appear as a character, and only in John is he raised from the dead. Only in John does Jesus wash the disciples' feet, turn water into wine, have a conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, and tell doubting Thomas to put his hands in Jesus' side. All this to say, there are significant differences between the content of John and the content of the Synoptic Gospels. Number 4. While the Gospel of John has significant differences between the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John also has some striking similarities with the Synoptic Gospels. As far as the overall structure, themes, and emphases of the text go, there are remarkable similarities between John and the 3 Synoptics. In the ancient world, the concern of biographies was not to present pure, objective information about a person. Rather, it was to convince the audience to think certain things about that person and present the information about their life accordingly. Therefore, it wasn't uncommon to write different accounts or biographies of an important person in very, very different ways. That all 4 Gospels present Jesus' life and death in essentially the same way is somewhat remarkable. All of the Gospels focus on Jesus' life, present its events in narrative form, and aim to convince their readers that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, or directly related to the God of Israel in some way. They do so by presenting Jesus' life, teachings, and wonders. They all have Jesus' ministry begin with his relationship to and baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. This is followed by the calling of the 12 disciples and the commencement of Jesus' ministry. In all 4 Gospels, Jesus has a confrontation with the temple authorities, which he then cleanses. In the Synoptics, this ultimately is the last straw that leads to Jesus' death. In the Gospel of John, however, it occurs near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. While about 90% of John is unparalleled in the Synoptic Gospels, there are some similar accounts that are shared between the two sets of texts. And even though the content is not identical, there are very striking similarities between the overall nature and purpose of John and the Synoptics. Number 3. The Gospel of John expresses a very high Christology. John is traditionally interpreted to have the highest Christology of all of the Gospels. That is, it most closely and explicitly relates Jesus to the God of Israel, and it does so from its very first words. John 1:1 begins by stating that the Word, Jesus, was God, and this theme continues throughout the Gospel in several different ways. On 7 different occasions in John, Jesus utters an I am statement, which many think echoes the revelation of God's name, Yahweh, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Jesus says, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth and the life, and the true vine. On a few other occasions, Jesus simply says, I am. Jesus also makes striking claims that closely relate him to the Father, stating that anyone who sees Jesus has seen the Father, that the Father is in Jesus, and that Jesus and the Father are one. The high Christology of John has led it to be called the most spiritual gospel and has been a fan favorite since the time of the early church. Origen claims that the Gospels are the first fruit of all of the scriptures and that John is the first fruit amongst the Gospels. The reformer Martin Luther in the 16th century claimed that John is to be far preferred over the 3 synoptics. This is because, on the one hand, John is simple and easy to understand. Yet, on the other hand, it contains multitudes. For this very reason, Augustine claimed that the Gospel of John is like a pool that's shallow enough for a child to safely frolic in, while also deep enough for an elephant to swim in. Number 2. The Gospel of John was written around the end of the 1st century CE by the beloved disciple. Unlike the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John does mention its author. Unfortunately for us, it does not mention its author by name. Rather, John 21 states that the disciple whom Jesus loved was the one who testifies to the things that were written in John and was himself the one who wrote them. So while John tells us who wrote the gospel is still technically speaking anonymous. It is without a named author. The beloved disciple that is mentioned in John 21, the gospel's final chapter, shows up elsewhere in the gospel, on 5 other occasions in fact, all of which are in the second half of the gospel. He's first mentioned at the Last Supper in John chapter 13, where he has a privileged seat at Jesus' side and, along with Peter, with whom the beloved disciple very often shows up, is given privileged information about who will betray Jesus. In John chapter 18, just before Peter denies Jesus for the first time, he, Peter, and the beloved disciple are in the courtyard of the high priest. And the reason they're allowed into the courtyard of the high priest when Jesus is going to be questioned is because the beloved disciple was known to the high priest. This has led some scholars to conclude that the author of John must have had some pretty serious and important connections in Jerusalem. At the crucifixion, Jesus tells the beloved disciple that he is now to consider Jesus' mother as his mother, and Jesus tells his mother that she is to consider the beloved disciple as her son, indicating that there's a close and special relationship between Jesus and the beloved disciple. At the end of the gospel, after Jesus has been resurrected, the beloved disciple races Peter to the tomb, and apparently he is the faster disciple. He also must have better eyesight because he's the first to recognize Jesus on the shore while the disciples are out fishing on their boat. So, the beloved disciple is an important character in the Gospel of John, though his identity is shrouded in mystery. He's purportedly the author of John, and from several aspects of John itself, we can glean some further details about his identity. This anonymous author has insider knowledge about festivals in Jerusalem. Jesus and the disciples celebrate more Jewish festivals in John than in any of the other Gospels. Unlike Luke, this author uses Hebrew and Aramaic words, though he's writing in the Greek language, just like all of the other New Testament authors. Finally, the author of John, the beloved disciple, knows the geography of both Galilee and Jerusalem, though his details about the latter, Jerusalem, tend to be more accurate than his details about the former, Galilee. This, combined with the fact that he was apparently known to the high priest, indicates that the author of John is familiar with the city of Jerusalem, perhaps because he spent much time there or even resided there. This might be because the author of John is John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' disciples who was part of his inner circle. While John was a Galilean, according to Acts, he also was one of the Jerusalem apostles and operated there after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. That this John, and not John the Baptist or John the Seer who wrote the book of Revelation, was the beloved disciple and the author of the fourth gospel, was the position of the early church and how we get the title Gospel of John. It makes sense insofar as John is one of the three disciples in Jesus' inner circle in the Synoptics, though he's never mentioned in the Gospel of John by name, unless, of course, he is mentioned under the title, the beloved disciple. There are also other interesting positions on who the beloved disciple and author of the fourth gospel might have been, including Mary and Lazarus, but the main competitor for the position that John, son of Zebedee, is the gospel's author, is that the fourth gospel is a somewhat communal product. Some suggest that the gospel is written by the so-called Johannine community, and the beloved disciple is a representative of this community and is supposed to be an ideal follower of Jesus. This makes good sense of the claim, which is made in the third person plural, that the beloved disciple is the witness to these things and the one writing them down. The claim is not made in the first person. It's not I, the beloved disciple, am the one testifying to these things, and I am the one writing them down. Rather, it is a third person, someone else who is doing the testifying and the writing. When it comes to the dating of John, most New Testament scholars place it near the end of the first century. The latest it can possibly date it is about 150 CE because there's a manuscript fragment of John chapter 18 called Papyrus 52 or simply P52, also called the John Rylands fragment, that dates to this time period. As far as New Testament manuscripts go, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest text that we have access to, even if it is a very limited amount of text. While it's not at all thought to be an original manuscript, it is very early and it helps solidify the fact that the Gospel of John must have been written before the mid-2nd century at the very latest. One other piece of evidence for dating John is Jesus' words about destroying the temple of his body in John chapter 2. While this isn't a direct prediction of the temple's destruction, like those that are found in the Synoptics, it does seem to imply knowledge of the actual temple's destruction and probably places John well after 70 CE. The standard view is then that John was written towards the end of the 1st century CE, some 10 to 15 years after the last Synoptic Gospel, probably Luke, was written. Number 1. The Gospel of John was written to foster belief. We are lucky enough to have a direct statement of why the Gospel was written. This appears in John 20:31. The reason that John was written was to foster belief. Unluckily, however, it is not clear what it means that the Gospel of John was written so that you might believe. There are issues of both translation and manuscripts with respect to this particular verse, and specifically the verb believe. The short of it is that there are two options for how the verb might be rendered in English. It could be translated, these things are written so that you might come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. The idea is that you might start to believe. Belief about Jesus as Messiah wasn't there until you read the Gospel of John. It could also be translated, these things are written so that you might continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. The Gospel of John in this view is meant to sustain belief. You believed previously that Jesus was the Messiah, and this narrative is going to help you to continue that belief and even strengthen it, perhaps in the midst of some kind of crisis. Whichever is the case, or perhaps both of these are meant at the same time, at the end of the day, the Gospel of John, in the text of the Gospel itself, directly equates the things that are written in the narrative with the importance of the belief of its audience.